In the history of how nations die, there is usually the sound of cannon fire, or the marching of boots, or the screaming of shells. But in the 19th century, the greatest empire of the Middle East was dismantled, not by soldiers, but by accountants. It was conquered not with gunpowder, but with compound interest. This is the story of the first true debt trap in modern history. It is the story of how the Ottoman Empire, a superpower that had terrified Europe for centuries, was slowly suffocated by the banks of London and Paris. It is a cautionary tale that echoes loudly in our modern world, because it demonstrates a brutal geopolitical truth, which is that you do not need to invade a country to own it, you simply need to hold its mortgage. To understand how this tragedy unfolded, we must look at the Ottoman Empire in the middle of the 19th century. To the outside observer, it still appeared to be a titan. It stretched from the Balkans in Europe across the mountains of Anatolia, down to the holy cities of Mecca and Medina, and across the deserts of North Africa. The Sultan in Istanbul ruled over millions of subjects and sat on a throne that commanded the crossroads of the world. But beneath this surface of imperial majesty, the foundation was rotting. The empire was economically sick. While Britain and France were undergoing the Industrial Revolution, building steam engines and factories and railways, the Ottoman economy remained frozen in a medieval agrarian past. It was a land of peasants and craftsmen trying to compete in a world of machines. The treasuries of the Sultan were chronically short of cash. The tax system was archaic and inefficient, relying on corrupt local officials who stole half the revenue before it ever reached the capital. For centuries, the Ottomans had solved their cash flow problems by debasing their currency or confiscating the wealth of rich officials. But in the modern era, these medieval tricks no longer worked. The empire needed capital to survive. It needed to build a modern army to defend itself against the predatory Russian Empire to the north. It needed to build roads and telegraphs. It needed to look and act like a modern European power. For a long time, the sultans had resisted the temptation to borrow money from the West. There was a deep cultural and religious aversion to usury and a political fear of becoming dependent on the Christian powers of Europe. But in 1853, the dam broke. The Russian Empire invaded Ottoman territories, sparking the Crimean War. This was a conflict of massive scale that the Ottomans could not afford to fight alone. Britain and France, terrified of Russian expansion, stepped in to help the Turks. They sent armies and fleets to the Black Sea, but they also sent bankers. The war was costing the Ottoman treasury millions of gold liras that it did not have. The soldiers needed to be paid, the cannons needed to be cast, and the ships needed to be provisioned. The Sultan Abdülmecid I was desperate. His advisors told him there was no other choice. To save the empire, he had to break the ancient taboo. He had to take a loan. In 1854, the Ottoman Empire signed its first foreign loan agreement with a syndicate of British and French bankers. It was presented as a lifeline, a gesture of solidarity from allies fighting a common enemy. But in reality, it was the first shackle of the golden handcuffs. The terms of the loan were predatory. The bankers knew the Ottomans were a credit risk, so they demanded a steep price. The issue price was set at 80, which meant that for every 100 pounds of debt the Sultan signed for, he only received 80 pounds in cash. The bank kept the difference as a commission and a risk premium. However, the empire had to pay interest on the full 100 pounds. This was the original sin of Ottoman finance. They were borrowing money at an effective interest rate that was punishingly high, while receiving far less cash than they owed. But the cash that did arrive in Istanbul felt like a miracle. Suddenly, the army could be paid. The crisis was averted. The Russians were eventually defeated, and the Sultan felt a rush of relief and power. He had discovered a magic trick. He realized that with a simple signature on a piece of paper in London, he could summon fleets of gold to his doorstep. The war ended in 1856, but the borrowing did not. The Sultan and the Ottoman elite had tasted the forbidden fruit of easy credit, and they became addicted instantly. They looked at the shining capitals of London and Paris with their gaslit boulevards and their marble opera houses, and they felt a deep sense of inferiority. They wanted Istanbul to look like a modern European capital. They wanted to prove to the world that they were not the sick man of Europe, but a civilized and wealthy power. So they began to spend. But they did not spend the borrowed money on factories or irrigation or education or things that would generate a return on investment. They spent it on prestige. They spent it on the ultimate symbol of imperial vanity, which was the Dolmabahce Palace. Sultan Abdülmecid decided that the old Topkapi Palace, the home of his ancestors for 400 years, was too old-fashioned. It was too Asian. He wanted a palace that rivaled Versailles. He wanted a palace that would make Queen Victoria jealous, so he ordered the construction of a massive edifice on the shores of the Bosphorus. The Dolmabahce Palace is a building of staggering opulence. It is filled with 14 tons of gold leaf. It contains the largest crystal chandelier in the world, a gift from the British Queen. The staircase is made of baccarat crystal. The carpets are silk. The walls are lined with Italian marble. It is a breathtakingly beautiful building, but it is also a tombstone. It was built entirely with borrowed money. While the peasants of Anatolia were scratching a living from the dry earth, using wooden plows, the Sultan was importing crystal from Bohemia and gold from France to decorate a house he could not afford. The cost of the palace was 5 million Ottoman gold liras, which was the equivalent of a quarter of the entire yearly tax revenue of the empire. To pay for this, the Sultan went back to the bankers in 1855, then again in 1858, then again in 1860. Each time the bankers in London and Paris were happy to lend. They were making a fortune on the commissions and the high interest rates. They knew the empire was struggling, but they assumed that Britain and France would never let the Ottomans fail because they were geographically too important. This is the concept of moral hazard. The bankers took risks because they believed the governments would bail them out. By the 1860s, the Ottoman financial situation had turned into a classic Ponzi scheme. The empire was not generating enough tax revenue to pay the interest on the old loans, so it had to take out new loans just to pay the interest on the previous ones. They were digging a hole to fill a hole. The debt payments began to consume the entire budget. In 1860, the empire was spending perhaps 15% of its income on debt. By 1870, that number had risen to over 50%. Think about the implications of that figure. 50 cents of every dollar collected from a fisherman in Greece or a farmer in Syria was leaving the country instantly to pay a coupon to a bondholder in London. That meant there was no money left for the army, no money for the navy, no money for schools, and no money for infrastructure. The state was being hollowed out from the inside. To keep the system going, the government turned to a group of local financiers known as the Galata bankers. These were mostly Greek and Armenian families who lived in the Galata district of Istanbul. They acted as loan sharks to the government. When the treasury ran dry before the next big European loan came in, the Grand Vizier would go to the Galata bankers and borrow money at short-term rates of 18% or 20% or even higher. It was financial suicide. The Sultan at this time was Abdulaziz, who had succeeded his brother. Abdulaziz was a man with a massive ego and a love for military hardware. He didn't just build palaces, he built a navy. He looked at the British Royal Navy and decided he wanted one too. He ordered massive ironclad warships from British shipyards. He bought the latest Krupp cannons from Germany. For a brief moment, the Ottoman Navy was the third largest in the world on paper, but it was a fleet that the empire could not afford to fuel or maintain. The ships sat in the Golden Horn rusting because there was no coal. They were floating piles of debt. The tipping point arrived in 1873. A financial panic started in Vienna and spread across the globe, causing a depression known as the Long Depression. Global capital dried up. The European banks, suffering their own liquidity crises, stopped lending. The music stopped. At the exact same time, nature turned against the Ottomans. A catastrophic drought struck the heartland of Anatolia in 1873 and 1874. The crops failed. The sheep died. The peasants, who were the tax base of the empire, faced starvation. Famine stalked the land. The tax collectors went into the villages demanding payment and found nothing but dust and corpses. The revenue stream collapsed, but the debt payments remained fixed. In the summer of 1875, the Grand Vizier, Mahmud Nadim Pasha, looked at the ledgers and realized the game was up. The treasury was empty. There was a massive payment due to the European bondholders in October, and there was simply no cash to pay it. He tried to float a new loan, but the markets were closed. No one would lend a penny to the sick man. The empire faced a choice. It could starve its own people to pay the foreign bankers, or it could stop paying. On October 6, 1875, the Ottoman government issued a decree that shook the financial pillars of Europe. It was known as the Decree of Ramadan. In this document, the government announced that it would cut its debt payments in half. It would pay 50% in cash, and the other 50% in paper IOUs that promised a 5% return. In the polite language of diplomacy, this was a moratorium. In the brutal language of finance, it was a default. The Ottoman Empire had gone bankrupt. The reaction in Europe was furious. Millions of middle-class investors in Britain and France had bought Ottoman bonds because they offered high yields. Vicars in England and shopkeepers in Paris saw their savings wiped out overnight. The newspapers screamed that the Turks were thieves and swindlers. The diplomatic support that Britain and France had given the Ottomans against Russia evaporated. This financial weakness immediately invited aggression. Seeing that the Sultan was broke and friendless, the Russian Empire saw an opportunity to finish the job they had started in the Crimea. In 1877, Russia declared war. The Russo-Turkish War of 1877 was a disaster for the Ottomans. The Ottoman army fought bravely, but they were unpaid, undersupplied, and demoralized. The Russians marched all the way to the suburbs of Istanbul. They could see the minarets of the Hagia Sophia. The empire was forced to sign a humiliating peace treaty ceding vast territories in the Balkans and the Caucasus. But the most devastating clause of the peace treaty was financial. The Russians imposed a massive war indemnity. They demanded that the Ottomans pay them over 800 million francs as punishment for the war. Now the Ottoman Empire was in a truly impossible position. It owed hundreds of millions of pounds to the British and French bankers, which it had already defaulted on. And on top of that, it now owed a massive war debt to the Russian Tsar. The total debt load was now far greater than the entire value of the Ottoman economy. The empire was insolvent. It was defenseless. It had lost its credit, its territory, and its dignity. The Sultan Abdul Hamid II, who had ascended the throne during this chaos, sat in his palace knowing that he was the ruler of a corpse. He waited for the European powers to carve up his lands, but the British and the French had a different idea. They didn't want to conquer the Ottoman Empire territorially. That would be messy and expensive. It would require armies and administration. They had a much smarter idea. They wanted to conquer it financially. They realized that if they simply annexed the Ottoman economy, they could extract wealth indefinitely without the hassle of governing the people. In 1881, the representatives of the European bondholders came to Istanbul. They were not generals, they were bankers. They carried briefcases, not swords. They sat down with the Ottoman officials and dictated the terms of surrender. They weren't asking for land, they were asking for the cash flow. This negotiation led to the Decree of Muharrem issued in December 1881. It was the death certificate of Ottoman independence and the birth certificate of the debt trap. It established an organization that was unique in the history of imperialism. It was called the Ottoman Public Debt Administration, or the OPDA. This was the mechanism of the soft conquest. The OPDA was not a government agency. It was a corporation run by a board of directors representing the banks of Britain, France, Germany, Italy, and Austria. It was headquartered in a massive fortress-like building in Istanbul that loomed over the city, a physical symbol of who was really in charge. The decree handed over the empire's most valuable sources of revenue directly to this foreign corporation. The Sultan agreed that he could no longer be trusted to collect taxes, so the OPDA would do it for him. The taxes on silk were handed over to the OPDA. The taxes on salt were handed over to the OPDA. The taxes on fishing, the taxes on spirits, the taxes on tobacco, and the stamp duty on all legal documents were all legally transferred to the control of European bankers. The OPDA built its own bureaucracy. It hired over 5,000 tax collectors. These men wore uniforms, carried weapons, and answered not to the Sultan, but to the board of directors. They fanned out across the empire, from the mountains of Macedonia to the coast of Syria. They went into the villages and the markets, and they collected the wealth of the Ottoman people. If a fisherman caught a fish in the Bosphorus, a portion of his profit went to pay a bondholder in London. If a farmer harvested silk cocoons in Bursa, the profit went to a banker in Paris. If a peasant bought a bag of salt for his soup, the tax went to Berlin. It was a state within a state. The OPDA was incredibly efficient. Unlike the corrupt Ottoman bureaucracy, the OPDA was run with modern European accounting standards. They built warehouses, they improved salt mines, they distributed disease-free silk worm eggs to farmers. They actually grew the economy. But they grew it for the benefit of the creditors, not the citizens. Between 1881 and 1914, the OPDA collected roughly 1/3 of the total revenue of the Ottoman Empire. Think about that figure. 1 out of every 3 coins generated by the economy was siphoned off and sent abroad to service the debt. The Ottoman government was left with the scraps. They had to run a massive empire, pay an army, and maintain a court with only 2/3 of their own tax base. This meant that the Ottoman state remained perpetually poor. They couldn't invest in education, they couldn't build their own industries, they couldn't modernize their infrastructure. They were trapped in a cycle of underdevelopment because their surplus capital was being extracted by the debt trap. The Sultan became a puppet in his own house. He reigned, but the OPDA ruled. If he wanted to build a school or a road, he had to ask the bankers if there was any money left over. Usually there wasn't. But the debt trap didn't just extract money, it extracted sovereignty. It became the tool by which the European powers manipulated Ottoman foreign policy. And this opened the door for a new player to enter the game, a player that would lead the empire to its final destruction. Germany. While Britain and France were content to just squeeze the Ottomans for cash, Germany saw a strategic opportunity. The German Kaiser Wilhelm II visited Istanbul and embraced the Sultan. He told the Ottomans that the British and French were parasites who only wanted to bleed them dry. He claimed that Germany wanted to be a friend. Germany wanted to build them up. The Germans proposed a massive infrastructure project that would change the map of the world. The Berlin-Baghdad Railway. It was a dream of steel connecting the heart of Europe to the oil fields of the Middle East, and the Persian Gulf bypassing the British-controlled Suez Canal. For the Sultan, this was a lifeline. A railway would allow him to move troops to suppress rebellions. It would modernize the economy. It would tie him to a powerful military ally. But who would pay for it? The Ottoman